So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and dear fellow panellists, a good morning and a warm welcome to you. My name is Jamie Shea. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at Nato. I may not have the most important job in Nato, but at least I've got the longest job title. So life does have its consolations. The first thing I'd like to say is that one of my favourite sort of quotations, particularly when I have to give a speech on cyber, comes from the British poet Shelley, who famously said of Lord Byron that he had lost the gift of communication, but unfortunately not the art of speaking. Indeed, when I tell my children that I'm going to a conference to give a speech on cyber, they sort of roll about laughing, because I definitely put myself in the digital dinosaur category, rather than, as they are, of course, the digital native category. So what I want to say right from the beginning, before we kick off, and I kick off with some introductory thoughts, is that I'm not a cyber techie, really not at all. In fact, until a few weeks ago, when I heard the term petrabyte, I thought that this was a dying signal of love from one of my former German girlfriends than something that was connected to the virtual world. So I, frankly, yes, as somebody who started out dealing with nuclear policy or weapons of mass destruction or the conventional balance of power in the Cold War in Europe, for the first part of my career, in any case, I have been on a rather steep learning curve. And today, I still deal at the strategic political level in NATO with cyber policy and cyber issues. And therefore, as we get into the topic of international cooperation and the future in the cyber domain, which I do feel is a very, very good topic, I want to put down a marker that I'm going to try to frame the debate the way I see it, because déformation professionnelle, you know, where you sit is where you stand. We're all sort of embedded in a particular view of this from our own institutional culture. I would like to make it clear that I'm going to speak basically about this as a political issue and challenge, because that's the way I have to deal with it myself. And as we get into the debate, and we have a very rich diversity of people on the panel, we will obviously hear many other angles as we all come from our particular starting point, heading towards this goal of an effective international framework which works to handle cyber security. But we also fortunately have fortunate today to have a speaker from the World Bank. I'll introduce her later. I think as we look at this, we also are mindful that whereas perhaps at the beginning of the internet, the problem was that there was too much freedom and spontaneity and probably not enough security, we were rather late at getting into this, and we're now having to try to retrofit security into an existing framework, which is always painful when it isn't designed at the very beginning. We mustn't go to the other danger, which is, of course, then to see it purely as a security headache and a security problem, something that has to now be sort of put back in its box, so that we lose, of course, sight of the fantastic economic, and we'll hear later about development opportunities from the continuing expansion of the internet. We in NATO tend to worry about it as a security headache, and therefore we may lose sight of the fact that this is not a headache. It's ultimately a good thing, which has empowered and enriched and liberated and improved the lives of vast numbers of people across the world too. But the first point I'd like to get into, as I try to frame the discussion today, is, of course, that the internet, for us, from somebody like me, from a security policy background, is probably the biggest intellectual challenge I've ever faced. And for two obvious reasons. The first thing is it breaks down all of the barriers that we were used to, or all the categories that we grew up with and felt comfortable with. Deterrence. We know how that applied in the nuclear field, and we worked it out rather successfully. How does it apply in the cyber domain? Traditional concepts like the international law of armed conflicts, you know, where do they apply or where do they not? If somebody attacks you with a major cyber weapon, are you limited to a response in kind, electrons versus electrons? Or are you at a level of destruction legally entitled in international law to then respond with other types of weapon, kinetic types of weapon. Where is the degree of equivalence? Can you respond in such a physical way for attacks that cause a lot of disruption but don't actually kill anybody, which of course is totally the opposite of the nuclear and conventional weapons, which were designed to kill people, that we grew up with? What is the threshold of pain beyond which a state can declare, for example, an Article 5 collective defence provision in NATO? And how certain do we have to be of the degree of attribution? How sure must we be that we know where the attack came from before we can respond? Is it enough to say to a state, it happened on your territory, and therefore, even if you claim that you weren't directly behind it, you should have known about it, you should have been able to stop it, you must have had a role in condoning it, and therefore we hold you liable? Is that enough, or do we need a more exacting standard? So we're forced in the cyber domain to sort of think, where do our existing concepts still hold value, are still valid, but where do we need new things? For example, in international law, new standards, new confidence-building measures, new treaties to deal with the specificity of the cyber domain. This is still a new area, frankly, and we're finding it difficult to come, as you know, to a universal view of this, particularly between, for example, the Western countries and countries like Russia and China and others who often take a rather different view of this. The second thing, of course, is that cyber, as I said, collapses the borders. What is the distinct difference between cyber attack and cyber crime? It's becoming really difficult as states use proxies to carry out these attacks, or proxies get hold of the technology, the know-how, the expertise, the destructive power that used to be the preserve of states. The old days it was simple. The big guys had the material, the little guys didn't. That's finished now. Cyber has sort of become a great democratizing force, and then it can make everybody into a weapon of mass destruction, provided that individual has the skills, the modems, the know-how, the malware, and the rest. Even today, we are still in the military community baffled by the fact that a red team using a $20 malware freely accessible on the internet in military exercises is still able to penetrate our systems. And therefore the gap between the methods of attack and the means of defence is still much larger than a military person, a security person, would wish it to be. We've narrowed that gap very significantly in other areas, conventional balance, nuclear balance. How do we narrow that gap in the cyber area? It's still a massive intellectual problem for us. And therefore, of course, and this is the theme of today's discussion, and we're going to spend, I hope, a very informative morning looking at it. This brings about, therefore, the second big challenge, which cyber requires a much broader coalition if you're going to deal with it, than anything that we have faced in the past. When we were in the nuclear field, we didn't need the cooperation of the private sector to have effective nuclear deterrence. We didn't need buy-in expertise from the outside. We didn't need to build public-private partnerships. Governments were largely able to do that by themselves and with their own people. And a tank, of course, only had one purpose. And a tank was only owned by governments. You may have people in the UK these days driving around in American Humvees, but in the past, military equipment, the means were the monopoly of states. Only they legally could own these materials, only they could afford these materials as well. Today, of course, it's very different. We know that just as the cyber attack community is very adept in the virtual world, at crossing borders, in building coalitions, forming alliances and groups. Anonymous or Lutsec, of course, are ones that we're all familiar with in the world of political protest. So we have got to become equally adept at building these sort of new partnerships, trusted communities, where we all feel that we should contribute because we all have a common interest and we all benefit equally. But of course, it's typical that the criminals are always much better and faster at forming these coalitions than we are. And so today's debate, I think, is very much going to be focused on where are we and what do we still need to do and how can we remove those remaining obstacles towards forming these true effective partnerships. We all know from a strategic point of view that ultimately cybersecurity is never going to be finished. There's never going to be a point at which we declare victory and can all go home. A famous British liberal philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, once said that the price of democracy is eternal vigilance and the price of cybersecurity is going to be eternal effort. This cat and mouse game of vulnerability, attack, patch, and move on, this is going to continue for a number of years to come. And probably there will never be a stage, any more than we've found a cure for the common cold, where we ultimately have the answer. From a strategic point of view, the best analogy I can give, although there are many, is probably the U-boat campaign, the submarine campaign in World War II. We never, ever, from an Allied point of view, stopped German submarines sinking Allied ships. It went on right to the end of the war. But by learning fast, by combining technology like radar, ultrasound, the depth charges, by employing different tactics like convoy systems, by persuading reluctant shipping companies to go in convoy systems, by rerouting, by redundancy, by reorganisation, by better intelligence gathering, by sabotage operations even. Ultimately, all of these things came together to mean that U-boats were no longer strategically decisive. They weren't going to win the war for the other side. We got them from existential threat down to inconvenience through a great effort. And I've wagered that what we want to do, at least in the cyber domain, is somewhat similar to that, to at least have a situation where we can carry on our business, even in degraded environments where we are perhaps losing control of some of our systems, while keeping the essential functionality of our critical infrastructure, of our air traffic control systems, of our electricity grids, of our water plants and so on, keeping that basic functionality going. Ultimately, of course, deterrence in cyberspace will be based less on I know who you are and I'm going to punish you, and more on the fact that, well, you can try to attack me, but ultimately you're not going to succeed, so why expend all of this money and effort trying? We're a long way from that goal. What do we know? Well, the first thing we know is that at least the challenge of protecting our information technology systems is going to get bigger and bigger as we go ahead into the next decade, despite all of the efforts that we're going to be making. There are 3 billion users of the internet today, and that's going to grow. That's 1/3 of the population of the world. And experts anticipate that the number of internet-connected devices around the world will increase tenfold between now and 2020. So the exponential growth in the the amount of territory to be covered, as it were, is going to continue. We know also, of course, that even if maybe some of the hyperbole that we've heard from policymakers on the cyber threat, such as cyber Pearl Harbor or the cyber being the biggest wealth theft in history, or cyber now having gone past the narcotics trade in terms of profits from organised crime, even if we can debate whether all of these things are true, we do know that we still face a number of very pressing problems. And I very much hope that our panellists, from their own perspectives, will touch on these today. Let me just, if I may, from my perspective, mention some of these, but I'm not making this too NATO focused because I want to generalise the discussion in a way that can relate to not only the panel, but all of you in the audience as well. First of all, the lack of international norms, legislation or agreed practices. The policy versus technology gap. I referred to this already. There's been lots of effort. I mean, we're having another big meeting in Seoul, in Korea, in just a couple of weeks' time, going from London and on to Budapest. This effort to come up with an international framework of confidence-building measures that would oblige states to cooperate with each other in the event of a cyber attack, provide information, permit investigations, take action, for example, to block the source of attacks. A lot of effort has gone along there, but we're still far from getting that. Secondly, the threats are still growing in sophistication. For example, if you look at figures from Symantec, which all of you are familiar with, and these go back to 2011, over 5.5 billion attacks on software alone, which means that each average breach exposed 1.1 million identities and nearly 5,000 new vulnerabilities were identified in one calendar year. Over 400 million unique variants of malware were discovered to take advantage of those vulnerabilities, which was up 40% on the year before, 2010. And we know, as I said before, that some of the toolkits cost between $40,000 and $4,000 on the internet. It's still rather depressing, ladies and gentlemen, that 80% of the successful attacks are still against known vulnerabilities using fairly rudimentary means, and where basically lack of personnel training, lack of basic standards in companies, lack of senior management attention. You know, too often you go around and you say to the CEO of a company, what about cybersecurity? He says, oh, sorry, but John, my chief information officer, he's on leave today. You'll have to come back. The lack of an awareness at the senior level. So still, you know, we are dealing not only with sophisticated attacks, but a sort of overhang of still basic cyber education and defense, which we should have plugged years ago, still not being done. Basic cyber hygiene. Still responsible, lack of it, for 80% of successful attacks. But we are now dealing with something else, which is not just, you know, the attacker going against known vulnerabilities using known malware, but increasingly sophisticated attacks, many coming from states, which are looking, of course, at unknown vulnerabilities, the so-called zero-day exploits. And then thirdly, and this is the most worrying of all, the even more sophisticated attackers who are actually creating vulnerabilities in your systems where they didn't exist before, and of course inserting malware, either short-term or time bombs due to activate later to exploit that. So in other words, we're going from a world where we knew we were being attacked, you know, your screen went down or something happened, okay, panic, but at least you knew what was happening, to an increasing world where we don't know that we've been attacked. Most of the revelations today, like in Belgium, the country where I live a few days ago, were sort of, you know, people discovering in the Prime Minister's office or the Foreign Ministry a major hack which had sort of happened 2 years ago, and they've only just now woken up to it, and therefore how much information has been exfiltrated in the meantime. So increasingly we are going from defense to the problem of detection. How do I know that I have been penetrated? And how can I find out without paying a massive cost in security protection, or without, you know, having to sort of mainly sort of deconstruct my software, you know, microprocessor, transistor to transistor, every day of the week? Indeed, this is going to be an issue. The threats keep on growing in sophistication. And therefore we are dealing with the increasing professionalism and technical knowledge, as well as the persistence of the criminal community. And of course, as I've said, this is a major problem where we increasingly find that states who gain this information are able to hand it over to private sector companies to give them a commercial advantage. So private companies are helping states, but states are helping private companies. Again, this is a division that is breaking down. In the United States, for example, the Congress is considering legislation to say that if I know you, a private company, are using intellectual property which has been stolen by a state as a result of a cyber attack, can I clamp economic sanctions on you for you know, fraudulently using our intellectual property in your manufactures? Of course, companies too, like all organisations such as Nato, have to ask themselves the question of, am I investing enough? You know, is the average of, say, 2% for retail or 5% for critical infrastructure, or 6 to 8% for banks. Is that enough to give me protection? Am I underinvesting and therefore being criminally liable? Or if I, listen to the latest technology company that scares me to death with all kinds of stories about terrible malware coming my way and persuades me to spend billions on, I don't know, some new sort of encryption system or some new sandbox protection system, am I simply being taken in and getting sort of more insurance than I really need? Again, there is a flou artistique in many of these areas. Of course, as we go towards the cloud and the greater use of mobile phones, which offer great advantages in the commercial area, what are the new vulnerabilities that are being created? I hear very different, I'm not an expert, but I hear very different things about cloud computing, for example, in terms of security. And I think that we need, among policymakers, to establish the essential facts here. Of course, the problem is, as we go to the cloud and mobile phones, and in general, one of the things we notice in NATO is that there's just more classified stuff on the internet today. It leaks out. We know that. And that's not just NATO classified information. That is, of course, company classified information. The internet is a great connector. And so, sometimes in NATO, people phone us up from a company far away and say, hey, Jamie, did you realize I've just discovered one of your documents on my system? Fortunately, it's been low-level classification and old stuff. But we didn't know where it went. And one of the big issues that we face in NATO today is defining a methodology and protocols which allow us to actually identify on which national critical information technology we depend for our communications, and where that interconnects with NATO, so that when a NATO document goes out of a NATO collective system, we can track it and know where it is and where it's going at any one time. Traffic control on the internet, knowing where your stuff is extremely difficult as well. And of course, the bring your own device concept isn't going to help in that respect as well. So there are a lot of immediate challenges that we're going to face. Let me just, before I close, mention a few others and then say a few words about international cooperation. First of all, strategies. We're all in the business of defining strategies. But too often, I find that these strategies concentrate on processes, the mechanics. This committee should talk to that committee in terms of governance structures, rather than having a very good risk assessment in terms of having a good idea at the company level, the international level, of what are the threats that we are dealing with and how can we construct a good intelligence system so that we have as much early warning as we can about those threats. There's a lot of awareness out there, which is good, but awareness doesn't always translate into action, which of course is what we need. It's good to sort of suddenly become aware of the problem. We see far less evidence of people taking immediate responsibility. The other thing is baseline assessments. If you're going to do cybersecurity, sooner or later, you're going to have to do a baseline assessment of where you are and then establish metrics that allow you to know, am I improving or not improving? Am I staying on par with the threat? I may be doing a lot, but if the threat is evolving faster, I'm in fact moving behind. How do I know that all of the things I'm doing, which make me feel good and make me sleep at night, are in fact what I should be doing? Metrics. The problem is both in government and in the private sector, we don't have very much work on metrics. Another issue which I'd like to flag up, which is keeping us occupied at NATO, is that a great deal of effort is going into the prevention of attacks. Quite rightly, the immediate crisis management system, intrusion detection, forensics, and so on. Data capture packages,